86% of organizations value professionals that upskill to advance their careers. It's never too late. Enroll for a self-paced online course to begin upskilling in monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning, water, sanitation and hygiene, disaster risk reduction and management, food security and nutrition in emergencies, procurement and supply chain management, human nutrition and dietetics, maternal and infant young child nutrition. Apply today to enjoy a 10% discount.
Thank you once again, Diana, for that warm welcome, and to all our participants for today. So we're going through the understanding of dimensions in food security, and I am sharing my screen with you. Hope that everybody can be able to see it and that I am audible enough for everyone. So if the sound is good, we can continue maybe by a show of hands, just to make sure nobody is left behind. Okay, I can see one hand up, so I hope that is to mean yes. Thank you to those who've raised their hands. So on today's topic of understanding food security dimensions, first and foremost, we must establish that there is a lot as far as food security and nutrition is concerned. And most of the time, these two terms interact a lot when we talk of food security, whether it is assessment and the overall nutrition status of a population and health status. So they do go hand in hand. And in the meantime, we also want to establish where the differences are and where the similarities are, or where these concepts overlap. So these dimensions that we want to talk about, the first part is to also know what we can expect from today's webinar. We want to understand what food security is, to talk about the dimensions in detail, so that even as we are relating it to our humanitarian work, wherever we may be, or in the various aspects that we would like to be involved in when it comes to food security and nutrition, we are in a better position to understand what they mean on the ground to various communities, and how they are measured, how they are assessed, and why these interventions that are there, those that are in place or those that have been in place in the past, have to do with these particular dimensions. So it's a sneak peek to what the whole course of food security and nutrition offers here at HGI. So let us go on a learning journey together to understand what it is. And the first thing that I like to do is to establish what the difference is between food security and nutrition security. Because these are two terms that sometimes might get caught up in the jargon, and they can be used synonymously when they do not actually mean the same thing. And I'll also be able to show you practically what we mean between the two and how various factors affect this. So as we all know, based on the definition by the World Health Organization, is that food security means when all people at all times have access, meaning physical and both economic access, to sufficient, safe, and nutrition foods that meets the dietary needs, of course, and their preferences depending on the cultural practices of the community to maintain a healthy and active life. Now, on the other hand, nutrition security exists when, in addition to the access, when all people and at all times they have access both physically and economically to get the sufficient and safe food, here we are also considering other practices that impact nutrition status of a person as well as the health status. So in nutrition security, in addition to the three dimensions, we also must consider the caregiving practices, health and hygiene practices, and of course the access to a safe and clean environment, which of course in the end will promote how the food they are consuming is being utilized, how they also prepare the foods, and eventually what impact it has on their overall health and nutrition status. To put this into perspective, we also have different terms. When we hear hunger, we associate it a lot, especially in cases of emergencies. Malnutrition is still a major problem. And it is one of the greatest consequences of food insecurity, in addition to other factors. So for those of you who have been involved in humanitarian work, you can also let us know in the chat section how you found malnutrition, undernourishment, hunger, how they truly impact the community on the ground, because these terms, they are used very, very frequently. Nutrition security, we have the opposite of that. That is nutrition insecurity, food insecurity, undernutrition, and hunger. And we can also go to the extent of adding something we call hidden hunger, which is the micronutrient deficiencies. So this is just to give us a broader picture to understand that while they overlap, they affect each other in one way or another, and we are likely to find these issues where food insecurity is concerned, they are not meaning the same thing. They mean different things. And when we now come to understanding how nutrition security relates to food security, we must also consider these are some of the things that we will find in the field, and most people are affected, especially where poverty and urbanization are concerned, either exclusively or together at the same time. And to further explain this more, the relationship between food security and nutrition security, we can say that the dimensions that focus on food security are utilization. We have access, which is a major, major part, even in the definition by itself of what food security is. Then we also have availability. But in addition to this, we saw that the health status can also be determined by the care practices and how well their knowledge of hygiene practices are. So if we were to look at it from a national level, we have at the very bottom, a very big box I've put there, the agriculture in the area, both regional and subnational levels, will determine how the people respond and how the food security will be impacted. The capacity for agriculture, health and trade policies, and decision-making also impacts, maybe not directly, but they do have an impact on the overall food and nutrition security of a community or even in an area. We can use a community to put this into context. Good governance, of course, human rights and gender, which are some of the challenges or key important factors when it comes to uptake of any information or programs that might be introduced. We must also put the social construct there. Infrastructure, it determines both availability and access to this food that we are talking about. Social security, and even the risk as well as the legal frameworks. When we couple that with education, the quality of the education, how well this information or whatever programs and interventions that might be put in place, how well people understand the basics of the care practices, how well they understand the importance of creating abilities and skills to gain access, economic access, and also to get the food or increase availability of the food will depend on education. And here it is just a broad representation. However, here we are talking about care practices, whether it is breastfeeding, nutrition education, hygiene methods, access to health services, and all this relies heavily on how the information and education is disseminated. And even when there are nutrition interventions, where cases of undernourishment and malnutrition are very, very high, nutrition education will always be part of the intervention, because we need the community to really make this program their own. Aside from the food aid, which might be something that solves an immediate problem, the level of education in the long term will determine how the community views the interventions and sustainability of these assistance that will be provided. So we also see here, based on this chart, that there is a direct link between the food intake utilization, you can call it use, and the health status. Sorry, that is the health status, which will be utilization, and how they are taking the food. Decreased dietary intake can have a negative impact on the health status. And at the same time, a poor health status, especially those who are vulnerable because of various conditions, pre-existing conditions, when they are sick, there is a decline in their consumption, both in terms of diet diversity and even the quantity. So in the long term, it does affect the nutrition status of the person, and it also does affect how well they respond to medication. So all these are interlinked, and we cannot say there is one that is always in a straight line. They are constantly changing aspects that need to be reviewed, updated, and the proper interventions, policies put in place to mitigate these kinds of risks in the long run. Because we all know that as much as it has been a priority, poverty and also increasing the level of food security, it has been a priority for most organizations and humanitarian agencies, we still find that they are constantly changing. And these changes are changing in terms of these dimensions that we need to categorize as. So here I've just put a simple definition so that we can proceed to now discuss in detail what each first means. The first is availability. And during the conceptualization of these dimensions, availability was given a more of a broader look into it, because the argument was, this was, of course, many decades ago, but it is in reference to the Food and Agricultural Organization policy. And when they were looking at it in the 1940s, when it was first conceptualized, availability, the argument was that as long as there's supply of food, then households will in turn be able to get access to this food, and they can therefore utilize it. But a lot has since changed, which we'll get to see and understand these dynamics of how these dimensions interact with each other. So by availability, we mean the supply side of food security, how the food is getting to a particular area, production, and of course, we can determine this based on the stocks that could be there as social safety nets, as well as other imports and exports capacity of the country. So this can be addressed from a national level and even a global perspective, and it has a lot of impact on the, of course, the subnational level, regions, and even the communities, especially the rural areas. Economically, we also talk about access, both economically and physical access to the food. We're talking about the location as well as the financial capacity of an area, or even at a very low point. We can also use a household level to get more understanding on the aspect of access. We then have food utilization, which you've just mentioned, is how the body takes up the food and the nutrients in turn to improve the nutritional status and the health status of an individual. Then these three are the major ones. However, we also have stability, which is dependent on this particular aspect of stability. There could be food availability, there could be access and utilization. However, there are certain factors and could cause a breach for the availability of the food or even economic access, which destabilizes this whole chain. And it's also good to understand that as much as they are what determine food security, it does not essentially mean that they will be static through an entire duration of time. Things change, and there could be certain shocks that can lead to a very major difference in how either of these dimensions interact with each other. So next, we also get to look at an understanding of the timeline together with the dimensions that we have presently. So first, availability is the first one to start with. Let me also annotate this so that you can see it much better. So we start with availability. This one would be, in terms of hierarchy, availability would be first, because if there is no availability of food whatsoever, ultimately access is a problem, and so is utilization. And here, first, physical availability of the food, whether it is through subsistence farming or getting the food purchasing through the market and other sources that could potentially be available. We then look at the access, which a bit of takes a lot of time and also is a bit longer in terms of explanation. So when we talk of access, we're talking about physical accessibility, economically, meaning the purchasing power, and the safety of this food that we are consuming. Is it culturally acceptable as well? And is it now acquired by the household? So by the time it gets to the household, the next step is the distribution to the individuals residing in this household. And household is used as an example because when we look at even the conceptual framework, when it comes to household level and their overall nutritional status, we find that individuals in a particular household have very similar diets and feeding practices, and even hygiene practices, since they live under one roof. After allocation to the individual, it is then consumed. And this is the two aspects that now focus on the utilization. We started with availability, access to the point that it is allocated to every individual by whatever means or metrics that will be used at the household level. And then we have utilization. The individual has consumed this meal, and now they can be determined through an individual nutritional status on how well this food was utilized. So if we even look at stability again, which is something that happens over a long period of time, in order to maintain this curve or this flowchart of what usually happens, we also need to ensure that we're focusing on other external factors: climate, sustainable policies, infrastructure, whether it is health infrastructure or infrastructure in terms of roads, access that promote that, access to the food, economic empowerment, social programs to ensure that also gender representation is important. Because if we were to look at today, as much as modernization has happened, there's a lot of evolution in terms of gender roles. However, we also find that there are still limitations to some of the gender, especially when it comes to women and vulnerable groups such as children under 5 years old. Household resources also, and here we are looking at the social construct. We're also looking at economically in the region, in the country, maintaining the market also to ensure that this food is not only available, but it is also economically accessible to individuals and households. And also to summarize this part on the dimensions before we break it down together, it is also important to understand that it is not happening overnight. Sometimes you may have an emergency that was unforeseen, or it could be long-term. So depending on which one it is, even the dimensions that need to be addressed in terms of assessment of the food security, as well as the indicators, will be dependent on those factors that are currently affected the most. So first, we want to look at availability in detail. And here we are referring to quantity and quality. Keyword here being quality and quantity of the food. That means the capacity of a community, of a household, to provide food or put food on the table. And it is affected greatly by the agricultural production, either within the region or even subsistence farming. For places where they have parcels of land, they might have some farming either in a large scale to provide it as a source of food, but also as a source of income. However, there are those that engage in subsistence farming just for the household. And of course, the yields depend a lot on how high were the yields or how low are they. And we found that they'll also affect access, because if the agricultural production or the yields are reduced, their capacity is also reduced. That means it will affect the community both in terms of finances of these foods, or particular foods that considered will be even higher. So ultimately the access will be affected. Distribution and infrastructure, how well the supply chain is distributing food to particular areas. So areas where there is low infrastructure in terms of the road network, and they are also not able to get access to this distribution of the particular food, then that means that they'll not arrive at a timely manner, and the cost will also be high. And I don't know maybe about other countries, but in Kenya, in some places, you might find that the cost of an item at the area of production is much cheaper than an area where they have to travel thousands of kilometers, or let me say hundreds of kilometers, to deliver these foodstuffs to that area. Storage capacity again, because either one of these is missing, then it means it destabilizes the prices, which will affect the consumers directly. Then again, we must also consider the environmental factors, because the weather patterns, soil quality, water availability, farm inputs, they will have a great direct impact on the agricultural production. If they are better and improved and they are sustainable, we have better yields. However, if especially areas that are prone to floods and they also engage in large-scale farming, crop yield is affected, which in turn destabilizes the other dimension of access, especially economic access. So when we consider the food production, we must also consider the resources that are available. Because of the population growth recently, we have climate change, global warming is also a major challenge. They put pressure on the existing natural resources. So we must have that adequate soil capacity to improve the yields, and also have smart farming methods that will be able to be supportive of the agricultural production. So again, the resilience of agricultural system can be strengthened. And in the long term, we also find that the livelihoods are secured, especially for those who rely heavily on agriculture as their main source of income. Then we come to the food access, which is also something that is considered greatly when it comes to the 4 dimensions. Actually, the ones that are majorly talked about in a lot of publications and a lot of segments, food access is one of the greatest that are there. Yeah. And access, we mean in various ways, because food can be present. It is available, yes, but it does not mean that a household should also be food secure because there is food availability. We now transition to the food access, and remember the trail of thought we had earlier put up to show the various segmentation of each dimension. So here we are talking about resources. We are also talking about social construct and finances. So here we are also talking about how do they get access to this food. Here we can also consider again production, as earlier discussed, for subsistence farming, whether it is crops, they could be livestock, and it could also be fishing. There are many that of course have come up as many sources of whatever they could be farming, and so have the farming inputs and the methods. They've also changed. In some other places, they might not have the same capacity, because we must recognize that as much as a country could have food security at national level, we must always consider the arid and the semi-arid areas who do not have the same capacity or inputs to conduct their own production. So they might resort to fishing, gathering wild foods, or hunting in some places. And there's also purchasing at the markets and the shops, which for most urban areas is the go-to areas, whether it is the hypermarkets and the shops or the grocery shops. There are also, in some cases, where finances are very, very strained, they actually can do exchanges of items of food. If one person is growing, maybe an example of potatoes, and another person is growing maize, they can be able to exchange to provide food for each household. Gifts, of course, there's also what is given to people or shared amongst the communities, and even transferred food aid or through the stocks that the government has put in place as the safety nets of food capacity. To also continue looking at the food access, we look at the 3 classifications that it has. And an understanding of access is that it depends mainly on the amount of household resources and on the prices. So physical access is one. How are they located? Are they in a close proximity to where food can be acquired, whether it is a market or farms or whatever arrangement could be in the community, and also including safe movement to the location. An example would be in places where there's insecurity. That means even in the market days, they reduce the number of people who are going. So you find you might not have as much diversity of what foods to find at the market. Number two, a good example is recently we've seen how the COVID wave has really influenced the way people navigate through movement, and even the way the market structure has changed to a more online platform, while there's still some physical access. However, at the peak of COVID-19, we also found that there is limited labor migration, and there's also limited movement, meaning those people who have to travel for quite a distance to get the food, they were geographically limited, either because there was the curfews from one county to another or from one village to another to minimize the risk of COVID-19. However, that also limited the quality of the diet, and the diversity of which is a major part of the access classification or the dimension of access. This is the ability of a household or an individual to actually afford the food items. So here it is affected by the food prices, their income, their livelihood activity, the trade, and even the purchasing power. And a good example to give, currently globally, there is a great level of inflation. It has changed, of course, depending on whether the country is a first world country or a developing country. And you also see that in turn, if let's say there is food availability and they have access to it, when the prices of food items go up, you would expect that even those people who conduct farming and their harvests, if let's say the harvests were to drop, that means the food basket in the household also needs to be adjusted. And the result would be to now purchase, even whatever they were previously growing, they would have to purchase that. And from a market or economic perspective, you'd imagine that these people would now need to increase the number of purchases. So you'd see the number of purchases going up. But we must also put the economic access, the economic aspect into this, because if the purchasing power is low, meaning that their livelihoods have been compromised, or any changes to their current income, they will end up spending a lot more on the food that they need to fulfill the needs of the household. And at the same time, they will have to resort to foods of less diversification. So they might decide that they need to stick to the staples. That way they can easily afford the quantity that they need. However, the quality will be reduced. So to put that, of course, in a clearer terms, even when we look at it from a country or a regional perspective, developing countries face severe droughts. And we must also consider the climate changes that we are now seeing. At the same time, you find that the more they happen, you also find that the harvest volumes will shrink, prices of the food will increase, which now affects the availability and accessibility of food for households. So that is as far as financially is concerned. So when we talk of now social access, aside from the physical part and the economic part, we also find that there are those groups of people who are in an area, they might be either under represented in the community, or they could even be stigmatized for one reason or the other. So here we can put an example of even refugees who, or even internally displaced persons and refugees. They have left their livelihoods, they have run from whatever political instability, it could be violence or clashes. They have moved to a new area that has its own residents, but you find that in most of this area, and those of you who are also engaged in currently humanitarian work can also attest that in some of these places, or majority of them, they are not easily taken in by those who are existing residents of the area. And this is because even when we are doing assessment of food security or trying to plan for interventions, we must always consider them being vulnerable because they do not have a source of income, they do not have livelihoods to engage in, but at the same time, they are not properly welcomed into the community. So for them to penetrate the market and start finding ways of gaining access to food could be a challenge. And this is where food aid plays an important role for this kind of people. The other group also, and I can use COVID-19 as a recent example because we all know it here. And most people who were known to have COVID-19, even though they have recovered, we find that there's still a bit of stigma associated, especially when they visit public areas or areas such as markets and supermarkets. So that kind of discrimination can pose a major challenge for them in terms of access. Lastly, for this part of the social access, we can also consider where gender constructs are an issue. A household could be experiencing high levels of poverty where the man is the main provider or the main breadwinner. But you find that they do not promote culturally in some of these places, they do not promote like even women to engage in certain activities, maybe like cattle rearing or sale of cattle, which limits the income in the household, and definitely it will have a direct impact on how food secure the household is and the nutritional status of people in this group, considering the children. So on that aspect of access, I hope now we have a broader understanding on what each aspect means. So that now when we come to the utilization, it relies heavily on, of course, the availability of this food and access, both of the three aspects of access that we've just mentioned. So here we come now to what affects directly the nutritional status of a community or of a household. We are considering nutritional value and quality plus diversity of the food being consumed. And we're also putting into practice, if we remember the first one that we had a look at, the inclusion of hygiene practices, cultural feeding practices, as well as food preparation and dietary practices. So here we must consider the composition of the diet, nutrition and a diet, because there's a direct link between the two. Nutrition and diet go hand in hand if they are receiving the essential macronutrients and the micronutrients, which are the vitamins and the minerals that are important for healthy development and also general well-being. Food safety and hygiene, which I have mentioned, I think twice now, is very important for how the nutrients are taken up. It is also important for absorption of these nutrients and minimizing food-related illnesses, contamination related illnesses, and also waterborne diseases that are especially prevalent in children under 5 years. Thirdly, we also have the healthcare and sanitation. It does have a great role on the overall utilization, because as we saw earlier, there's a direct link between the health status and the food intake and the use, or rather, there's a direct correlation between the use and the utilization. Health status can lead to a decline in intake, while decline in intake can also lead to decline in health status. So facilities of healthcare and sanitation also do offer a lot in promoting the health of a community, and especially the vulnerable groups, because it means if they can access health care services, the capacity of this location or this dispensary, be it a hospital, to attend to these infections that could result in food safety and hygiene, to also track cases of malnutrition, has a positive or a negative impact in the prevalence of the issue being more widespread, especially nutrition-related health issues. And then we also look at stability. And it is dependent on the other three that we've just talked about, or they rely on each other. If they are conducting the external factors and also coming in at a national level to put in policy where we prioritize food safety, food security in terms of agricultural production, and even creating safety nets that can be able to mitigate transitory food insecurity, then it also means that we have that level of stability and it can continuously be engaged. And by stability, we must also consider the warning systems that put in place to pre-plan in case of an emergency, whether it is a flood or we have a drought. They can easily be able to handle that issue and get the support of the humanitarian agencies where needed. So in summary, on the dimensions of this food security, we can say that the availability part, we've talked about the crop yields, water supply, the stocks that are already existing, and also the trade. The prices have that impact on the access. How they trade, and direct, of course, from this, we also get the food prices. So this requires a bit more intervention to see some stability in terms of food prices and also controlling the markets, because as far as the market is concerned, it is an issue of demand and supply. When the demand is high, we also find that the prices also go higher. And when the supply is high, the price, of course, could experience a decline. And it is mutually exclusive to whether there's food insecurity in the region or not. So it requires a bit more mitigation, both from a global perspective and also from a national level, and involving all the key stakeholders as far as policy making is concerned. Access, again, we talked about for household food distribution, gender issues, where we must always consider that there are some households that are actually women-headed, which can, in terms of access for economically and socially, make it more vulnerable to food insecurity. Infrastructure, both in terms of health and as far as the geographical placement and other related network that connects this area to the rest of the supply chain. Utilization, we talked of health status, the nutrition knowledge, because that is what they can easily put into place, as well as the hygiene and care practices. They must always be paired with whatever interventions are provided. Cultural tradition, what foods they consider taboo and what they consider appropriate. And in some places, you might also find that the gender construct does play in cultural traditions, in that the type of food eaten by the men might be very different from what the children and the women consume, despite them having increased nutrient needs and energy needs due to various physiological factors. Then food preparation. As much as we can ensure availability and access, we must also consider that it is entirely up to the household to decide what they will spend their budget on food on and how they choose to prepare it. So on the stability side, we must also consider the supply, the reduction of the risk, environmental sustainability, and other policy and governance measures. So I see, of course, there are some that are asking, of course, some questions. So we'll come to that. So again, let us talk about a bit about the indicators, because when we are talking about this 3-dimension, mostly availability, access, and utilization, they will also play a role in helping us find indicators of food security, determining whether a community, a household, or an area where they are going through an emergency, they are food secure or not. So in the aid of gaining a proper food security assessment, when it comes to availability, we must look at, do the community or the household produce food on their own? Are they engaged in either commercial farming or subsistence farming? Do they have agricultural productivity in relation to whether they actually have the resources to do it or not? Do the country have a high level of food imports or the exports? Because food imports, or if a country is being food secure, it does not essentially mean that at the household level, they will be able to also be food secure. That just paints a picture that is very, very different from what is actually happening on the ground in the household level. And we'll see some of the examples for this as we continue. So, of course, food imports and exports will be recorded at the national level and to give us figures and estimates. If there is a decline in the food production, then the governing bodies can be able to make this up or make the gap up through more imports to maintain that level of food supply. And it also does sometimes rely on the food aiding end to meet that gap. Then we come to access. We look at secondary data from income and expenditure surveys to see how much households are spending on food. out of the total income. And here we can also determine if they are food secure or they're experiencing moderate food insecurity, or if it is severe. Food prices, again, because even now as we speak, they continue to go higher and higher, which makes it difficult for people who are already spending a large chunk of their income on food to continue maintaining the same food quantities and the same food policies. Nutrition surveys, and this will tell you a lot about their nutrition status, prevalence of disease, prevalence of malnutrition, and of course, how nutritional secure a community or a population is. Then in terms of utilization, here we must rely on both secondary and primary sources of information through health surveys, which are usually conducted continuously to determine the impact of intervention and also for mitigation of potential risks that could come up in the future. We also have health surveys that tell us a lot about whether there are pre-existing conditions and most of the cases that people report for. So that even as we consider food security, in some places, what they are more in need of is information on what and education on understanding how these hygiene practices have an impact on their overall health. Then microdeficiency assessment, which are usually done through biochemical tests and which could be issued if there are risks. However, we find anthropometric measures such as MWAC, the weight for height, the BMI for adults, also go a long way in understanding the nutrition status and therefore impact of the food insecurity in the area. So depending on where it is being done, then we'll use this information as a proxy to tell the nutrition status of that particular population. And we also consider the vulnerable groups, those with pre-existing condition or issues such as being disabled, the elderly, but children especially from 5 months to 69 months or under 5 will be used as a proxy to show the overall nutrition status of a population. Then we can also have a look at some of these indicators and put a name on it. For example, we use the food consumption score, and at a household level, we'll be able to see how frequent are the meals, when was the meal, or how frequent in a day, in a week, or even in a month. And we'll also be able to know through a checklist if there is a reduction in the meal frequency. So we call it primary information because this is information that needs to be collected directly from the households in question. Ensure that those who need the aids or the most immediate solutions are catered for and given priority. Then we have the coping strategy index. And here we are also looking again at a household level. We want to know in this household, are they, how much are they spending on food? Is there any changes to their lifestyle in order to mitigate the current food prices? Do they go for long distances to find food? And is there any sale of assets? It could be cattle, it could be furniture, it could be some of the items that they have in the household, and these assets in order to afford food. And here the coping strategy indexes in some places can be so severe that a household might resort to marrying off one of their daughters so that they can get the dowry, and in turn they can access the food or be able to afford this food. So this strategy index is also conducted at a household level, and depending on the geographical limitation to it, it can be coupled by geographical targeting to see where the issue is most impacted. Then we also have the income and expenditure. As I'd mentioned earlier, what amount was brought into the household and what percentage did they spend on food? If a household spends 50% or more to cater for their food needs, then it means that they are at risk of being food insecure. Because if there was any change or a loss of income, even slightly to it, they will move possibly from reducing the meals to now reducing both the meals and the quality and quantity will be affected. Lastly, we also have anthropometric measures. This tells us now about the utilization aspect, or do they meet the cutoff points for the nutrition status. So we apply both for children and adults so that we are able to find out the levels of malnutrition and be able to follow up with appropriate interventions or nutrition interventions, especially supplementary feeding. This is where it will help us know what the overall nutrition status of the population is. So based on these indicators, you can see there is what we consider measurement of access, measurement of availability, and also the utilization. This is just an example. There are more that can be used depending on the situation, fluid and adaptable to meet the requirements or the need of the particular area in focus. So there are many more that can be used together with secondary information, whether it is the repeated surveys that have been done, health surveys, and other government and stakeholder documentation that can be able to give us a trend of the level of food security and other emerging issues that can be given the appropriate attention that they need. So aside from these indicators, we can also look at the intervention and how they play in accordance to these dimensions we're talking about: availability, access in utilization, and even the level of stability. So we can start with what is considered short term. I know the short term is at the bottom, but we can also start with that because this is in the context of an emergency where food security has been compromised, and we must also be able to assist them accordingly. Food aid is always one of the most important, where where the levels of malnutrition are high or are above what is considered to be normal. We might have also other indicators that need food aid as an intervention, even in the case of IDPs and even refugees, or where their food stocks and overall food that they had produced is no longer viable. In order to meet their immediate nutritional needs, food aid is one of it. And it can be given in various forms, whether it is through wet feeding, where they set up a kitchen at large, or through dry feeding, where people are given rations to take home and prepare by themselves. Then we also have the input relief. If, depending on the nature of the emergency, if the yield is not up to par, possibly replanting would be the best course of action to immediately or in the near future ensure that they have adequate food supply. Input relief in terms of fertilizers, in terms of actual farm tools where they do not have any. Restocking of livestock capital where the most economic source of income was through livestock trading and cattle rearing, and also enabling the market revival so that that supply chain, at least it may not be fully stable, but we have that chain of demand and supply being met at least to a certain level. And it can also be paired with food aid so that it meets their needs both immediately and in the short-term future. When it comes to access and utilization, here we are considering food and cash transfers, asset redistribution, social rehabilitation programs, and nutrition intervention programs. For asset redistribution and even social rehabilitation programs, it ensures that the community takes this intervention as their own, and they can be able to run on it even months or even up to a longer period of time. And with it, they're offering support to the community, but also encouraging the other key members of the community to participate and express their needs, what they might find would be important in order for them to also grow. But it also must be coupled with multi-agency support, not just from one segment, but it must also be both non-governmental and governmental organization. Then establishing the social safety nets to support those who are marginalized and also those who are at risk, especially the vulnerable persons, and where we can consider gender to be an issue. Monitoring, of course, the vulnerability, identifying the vulnerable groups, and also the intervention impact by seeing, is there behavioral changes when we are putting these interventions into place, and peace building efforts where conflict is the main issue, or what has now affected the level of availability, access, and utilization, which in turn will cause instability in all the 4 dimensions. So when you look at the long term, when we are considering availability, we must consider enhancement of the food supply chain, of course, because there are those who are vulnerable and require that assistance more as compared to others. And that targeting now comes into play. Improving the rural food production, especially the small-scale farmers, they can easily feed their household when they have that parcel of land, or they are conducting subsistence farming, and they can easily also improve the food security of a household or two. So when a community is able to do that small-scale farming, they can ensure food supply for their household, or even with a neighbor, if there is a case where poverty is a major problem. And most of the time, they are interlinked. Then investment in the markets, infrastructure, both health facilities, roads, and making it more accessible to the food supply chain. Then the livestock sector again. So this can be needed both immediately and also in the long term, and resource conservation rehabilitation to make it more sustainable in a way that they have ideal farming practices, putting into consideration the changing climates, the conservation of the soil quality, the water, especially where water might be an issue. So even that is interlinked to the kind of agricultural interventions that promote sustainable farming practices, but also conservation of existing resources, so that they can still conduct their farming as usual. So again, when we now come to access and utilization, rural institutions, be it governance, schools, markets, and also health facilities. This applies where they could have been closed for whatever reason, whether an emergency is short-term or even has been ongoing or chronic, it has been going on for a long period of time. Access to assets, access to land, of course, and even financial system. So for this section, those 3 would be linked, because the only way to access this financial system, it could be either through interventions such as creation of social groups to support each other, or even other supporting organizations to have that initiative that brings together community members. And sometimes it could focus on gender, especially women, to have that support groups to engage them in economic activities that will in turn generate more income for the household, but at the same time supporting the needs of that community from a broader level. Strengthening the labor market mechanisms to ensure safe food, and this can be done even interventions such as food for work, where people have an initiative has been set up. Maybe it could be a large parcel of land where they are invited to farm, and they are in turn paid cash, or they could be given food rations that supports their daily food needs. So it can be interchanged depending on also the monitoring and evaluation measures that will be put in place. And rehabilitation programs. So as I said, such as the women's groups, or groups that once they come together, they're able to either gain financial access to grow their businesses, or even what they would require, whether it is farming or whatever activity that would be ideal for them. So stability, we are now considering diversification of agriculture. And there is, of course, if the agricultural sector in a location is supported, it also creates more employment, enabling more people to gain a livelihood, but also have access to food safety. Monitoring food security and vulnerability, and this is something that is continuous, so that there is safety nets put in place, and in case there is a drop in yields, or there is issues like inflation, there are safety nets that can be able to mitigate this problem before it becomes more chronic and affects a larger area. Then we also talk about the structural causes, as well as reintegrating more people or displaced people and refugees. That way they can be able to easily find route or find their routing and be able to engage in activities that would generate income with the help of course, the humanitarian sector and other key stakeholders. This relocation might be a challenge at first, but once they take some time and also get the proper integration, knowledge coupled with support in terms of resources, that usually gives a better outcome. Though it is not something that is happening immediately. It could take a lot of time because they must also include issues such as policies and also peace building measures to make it safe for the people to either go back to where they initially had settled or to find a new place where they can settle and facilitate their adjustment to the new area. So other than these interventions, there are much more, both immediate and long-term, that can be indicated, but it is just to help us classify on these particular dimensions. Now, as I conclude, even though I know I have gone past time just by a few minutes, so as we've also seen how the dimensions change in terms of food security, we have seen that the four key being availability, access, and utilization, together with stability. They are ever changing, and we must also update our information concerning occurring events or what could be happening around the world. So as also we evolve, and there are many changes in terms of the market, the level of food production, policies that have been set aside, prioritization of food security as a major issue in developing countries, there are also new thoughts that are being put into process. If you've also heard of this, you can also let us know your view in the chat section. We've also seen that there are two potential dimensions that might be considered or that are coming up in the conversations in the halls where food security is priority. And number one is agency. And here we consider agency to be the capacity of individuals or groups to make their own decisions and choices about what they eat, what they produce, and how it is produced, processed, and distributed. So this is behind the thought process that there may be availability of food, there could be adequate access both physically, socially, and economically. But at the end of the day, we must have that freedom. Households have that freedom to decide what they will cook, what they will produce or they will grow if they're engaging in farming, how they will prepare it, and how they choose to consume it in terms of frequency. So with that in mind, it is also to help us understand that they do play, that plays an important role in the overall outcome of food security and nutritional security. And again, we also have sustainability. And what we mean by that is that the long-term ability of food systems to provide food security and nutrition in a way that does not compromise future generation. Here we are also considering issues such as sustainable farming methods. We are also considering environmental stewardship or adopting agricultural practices which will conserve and enhance the available resources. For example, if it's use of greenhouses, we need to reduce the gas emissions and also promote biodiversity. Again, climate resilience. We all know how the recent changes in the climate, we've seen floods in areas that have never flooded before. We also find that there is a mixture in terms of the weather patterns that we are normally used to. Rain can be either extensive, leading to huge losses, or it can be reduced, meaning that they miss the planting season and the yields for that year are compromised. So here we must consider building food systems that are resilient to climate change impacts, whether it is drought, floods, and these changing weather patterns I am talking about. Then reduce the food loss and waste so that we minimize that throughout the supply chain, from production to consumption or from farm to table. This way, we are optimizing the resource use and we reduce the negative impact on the environment. Something else that could also be considered under sustainability is social equity, inclusivity, so that they produce opportunities both for marginalized communities and even gender roles to promote fair labor practices. In economies as well, recycling is definitely one of the things that we found to be more promoted in the current state, reusing, recycling, and also repurposing resources in a way that is sustainable. Now, here, what we can also say about these potential dimensions, there is a lot that could be said here, but until we also have ways of measurement, because measuring the agency and sustainability might not be something that is very, very solid yet. Therefore, they are just considerations that, as much as the other 4 dimensions come into play, there is that participation of communities and households on what they will consume, how they'll consume it, becoming a major discussion as far as the food cycle and the food systems are concerned. So therefore, we can also conclude that as much as these dimensions, we are just gaining insight on how they operate, what to measure for, and what some of the interventions are to support this dimension. There's a lot more to learn and to understand. So in our food security and nutrition courses that we have at HGI, you can be able to gain more understanding on food security assessment, management of malnutrition, and so many other courses that will be more beneficial to understand this. So at this point, we can maybe, I know I've gone above on the time, but perhaps we can answer 1 or 2 questions that would be, let me see the chat section that we can discuss just shortly. If there are any other questions, you can always ask on the Discord forum and we'll be able to answer those ones. So I'll select the ones that are open. Okay, maybe we can start. How can we promote food and nutrition security in emergency programming? So first, the assessment is the one that lets us know. First, there is no similar emergency from one to the other, but it depends on the extent of the emergency and, of course, what intervention objective the particular agency has. However, you must first be able to understand it from a point of extensively how food secure are they, or the extent of the food insecurity. And again, also do a food security assessment to determine who the vulnerable people are. Also understand from a household perspective what they do in terms of income generation, what they spend on food, and their perception on food security together with other resources that might be available. Now here, you will be able to now have a broader understanding on if we are coming in with certain interventions of what capacity or who are these interventions targeted for, and you'll be able to have a better criteria, which will even give better results, and it will minimize a lot in terms of inclusion errors and exclusion errors. So overall, you'll have better data, because also data is very, very important. Both secondary and primary data will be very, very essential here. So again, also maybe before I can continue, I can just add to that question, is that when we now look at something long-term to assist a particular community, let me use a community because it can't be one household, the activities that they also engage in will be very important to know. Once you have all the information and you're also doing comparison on their nutritional status, you're also comparing it from previous years and what interventions have been already set in place, you will then know what kind of interventions that need to be given from an agricultural perspective, from a malnutrition combating and health facility infrastructure perspective, and again, activities that the community can engage in to change that narrative. Though that one is usually long-term and involves participation and education of the community and key representatives on that area. Oh, and then let me answer this one. What are the constraints that face every country to achieve these indicators I mentioned? It depends on the country, because again, some countries are very food secure when you look at it from a global perspective. But in some areas, especially arid and semi-arid areas, where poverty is a problem, the narrative is completely different. So aside from maybe trade being an issue, their import and export capacity, global supply chain, prices also will affect these dimensions that we are talking about. So they are ever moving factors. There is never one that is completely straightforward, because as you know, market prices will change, climate will change and impact production. Even now in some areas, we've seen that the places where they're producing, I don't know, maybe I can give an example of Kenya, because that's where I currently am. Currently, you find that the price of onions has gone very, very high, meaning even in the markets, they are not stocking it as much because the price is high, meaning that the people are purchasing it less, or they are trying to find areas where it is much cheaper. On the other hand, tomatoes are readily available. There is excess in terms of supply, therefore demand is low, meaning that the prices are also changing. So that is something that you can also relate to wherever you might be, and consider it in terms of the specific country, whether it is a developing country or a developed country. In resource constraint setting, such as low and middle income resources, income countries, how can community-based food resources be best harnessed and used? So depending on the extent of the food that they have, the food resources that they have, either capacity to purchase or subsistence commercial farming, it will be different in every area depending on what they do for a livelihood and how whether they grow their own food or they are purchasing. Supporting the markets in where they do not have the capacity to grow this food is very, very important. It could be coupled with seed input and other farming input so that they can become more independent in terms of their own food production, so that they are in capacity. On the other hand, areas where they already grow this food, finding market in terms of selling this food to neighboring community. So they still need infrastructure, especially storage. A lot of places in rural areas in African countries, they have the capacity to grow. The land is there, but storage post-harvest is an issue. And even the way to find a market for their produce is an issue, because there's so many brokers in between, which in turn means they do not get the most value as compared to what they spent on growing this food. So improving market from the point of growing the food to market, farm to table process and supply chain can be improved in order to assist them gain the maximum for what they are growing. Okay, then from Dominic has asked, in terms of food utilization where cultural tradition blocked some people to eat certain foods, what can be done to ensure those people are allowed to eat all types of food, since it is a requirement for healthy growth and development? I do agree with you, Dominic. It is important for considerations to all the genders to consume certain foods. There are some areas where even certain parts of the chicken are left to the man, while others are left to the women and to the children. Certain places, eggs, it depends on the type of food. Diversity in terms of the different various sources of these nutrients we're looking for is number one, because that one does not impact negatively on their cultural traditions. And we cannot change cultural traditions overnight. Therefore, it must be followed up with nutrition education to help them understand. To help them understand that there is an importance in having all the food groups available for all genders and children included, especially children, because they have increased nutrient demands. So that education and also experiencing behavioral change, it needs to be from a point of understanding their culture and then introducing this information. And key leaders in the community to also spread the information. Maybe they'll take it up more when they can hear it from some of their own. From Issa, what are the main importance for integration of nutrition program and food security and livelihood program? Here, it is dependent a lot on the objectives of the stakeholders. What is it that you want to address? Based on the assessment that has been conducted, yeah, what are their current immediate needs and what can be done to first alleviate those issues? Most of the people is access to basic commodities such as food and combating the issues related to malnutrition or inadequate food consumption. For those ones, they'll need immediate handling, so that we can now consider after that, how can we improve their livelihood in the long term? So we must consider what they do, what resources are available once again, and also gender roles, the capacity of the area, the infrastructure, and more importantly, what objectives are being set in place. So I feel that that would be a very good place to start. And then it must also be adaptable depending on the community and what they consider to be a priority so that all the objectives are met. Okay, from Rachel. Rachel says, thank you for the presentation. Just wondering how this 4 dimension can be attained in emergencies, which are, sorry, I've lost that question. How these 4 dimensions can be attained in emergencies, which are common in this ever-changing humanitarian sector. They are part and parcel of whatever interventions will be done. They must be considered, because maybe when we classify it as the 4 dimensions, but I am sure based on the issues that I have listed extensively, we also find that these are challenges that will be faced by those who are in an emergency. More so where there is a loss of food production, where the nutritional status and the health status are affected. So it's not a question of how they can be attained, in that they are part and parcel from the assessment level, from the indicator level, and even to the interventions level. They are part and parcel of it, and they go hand in hand. Despite them ever changes, that is why there is different levels of interventions. We might find those that are being conducted by the humanitarian in terms of food aid. There are also those that will focus on long-term stabilizing the agricultural production, whether it is farm inputs. They'll have another set of objectives. At the same time, there are those that are at the regional level in that area. They must also have the safety nets. They must also have capacity to cater to, in case of health infrastructure. Sorry, in case of health issues that might emerge, they must also have that level of accountability, and even at national level and global level. So it is ever changing, but it is one where when we prioritize food security, both in terms of humanitarian, which they really do prioritize it in the context of emergencies, but at the same time, long-lasting and sustainable activities must be engaged in where the country is taking up responsibility. Okay. Okay, let me answer, because this one of them is a bit from Nadza. Says she's from Botswana, and she tells us in her home country, Botswana, food security has been a high priority for the government. Yes, it must be, because as long as a large population is not food secure, it gives a lot of rise to loss of livelihoods, low productivity, and high levels of poverty. So thank you for this information. I hope I'm pronouncing it Ndadza. I hope I'm pronouncing it well. So some of the intervention are: all under 5 kids are given free supplementary food at child care clinic for free, regardless of status. They receive soya beans, meal, cooking oil, and beans. Yes, high energy supplementary feeds that they can take home and prepare and also free seeds and fertilizer, and free plowing for 5 hectares for subsistence farming. So whoever was asking how we can integrate these dimensions into attaining food security, these are some of the interventions. Again, every country could have their own, but there are those that come out across. And then number 3, she also says free food at primary level, secondary and senior schools, supplementary school feeding. So that is on the aspect of rations and also supporting immediate food access. So thank you so much, Ndadza, for that aspect. Before we wrap it up, because I feel like these ones are more country specific. One last question. What is the difference between hunger and chronic malnutrition? So hunger is that uncomfortable feeling. The way it is usually defined from a nutrition context, it is that feeling, painful and uncomfortable feeling when one has not consumed a meal. However, sometimes it can be used interchangeably because you have hunger and we also have hidden hunger. Hunger is extensive to mean that an individual is food insecure or they do not have access to proper meal or adequate, both in terms of quality and quantity. There's also hidden hunger, which is the micronutrient deficiencies that cannot be seen unless they are tested or somebody shows clinical symptoms. On the other hand, chronic malnutrition is where it has been occurring for a longer period of time. And here we also have various aspects of malnutrition. Somebody is wasted, there is chronic weight loss. They are also showing aspects of wasting. They could experience stunted growth and other clinical issues such as edema, marasma, kwashiorkor, and some similar symptoms based on that, even though those are usually classified under acute malnutrition. So there is a key difference. Malnutrition is a consequence of long-term hunger or inadequate dietary intake and dietary diversity. And we also talk about malnutrition as a large part of the consequence of malnutrition. So maybe, Walter, you can join us for the food security and nutrition course that we have available. All right, so based on that, I think let me put a stop there. We can ask other questions if they do come up in our forum. And once again, thank you so much for your time. I hope we have been able to gain a better understanding of what these dimensions are, and hope we can continue this conversation at a different time, or as you also engage on the HGI team concerning the courses that we have on the same. Thank you all. I wish you all a productive day ahead and a week also. Thank you so much. Diana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mercy, for taking us through that. I believe we've all been able to learn a thing or two when it comes to, excuse me, when it comes to understanding the dimensions of food security in the humanitarian sector. So with that, today, I do apologize, we have gone a little bit over time, but I would like to say thank you all for all the questions that we have received on the same. And I want to say all these other questions, the ones we were not able to answer today, and in case if you have any other questions, we will be addressing them on our community forum. As Mercy mentioned, we have been able to share the link with you to register for our community forum. And that is where such conversations do happen, very interactive. Thank you so much for those of us who've also showed interest in the courses I did talk about, I did mention at the beginning of today's webinar. That is maternal, infant, and young child nutrition, food security and nutrition in emergencies, human nutrition, and dietetics. So thank you all for those of us who've been registering, who've been sharing their details to register for these courses. I would especially like to thank all attendees for today. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar on food security and nutrition. Thank you so much for the questions that have come through. For those that we've not been able to answer right now, I want to say that once again, we are answering them on our community forum. There are discussions going on the same. I'd like to thank Mercy, our expert for the day. Thank you so much. You've really taught us a lot today. You've really taken us through quite an extensive understanding when it comes to food security and nutrition in emergencies. I want to say a special thank you finally to the HG team, Humanitarian Global Team, for enabling such webinars to take place, for hosting such webinars, and even enabling the webinar to be live on Facebook. Again, we will meet here next week on Wednesday. As usual, we always have our webinar every Wednesday. So next week, we will also have a webinar, and we will share with you the details to be able to register for the same webinar. With that, I do bid you farewell until we meet next time. Goodbye.
My name is Adam Mohammed. I am a humanitarian person and a farmer at the same time. I am also a Nigerian. My journey as a humanitarian started sometimes around 2016 in the NYSC camp. You know, when you finish your degree program, you need to go for a year training. So in Nigeria, we call it NYSC, National Youth Service Corps. So while at the camp, I have this staff of CUSO International. CUSO International actually is a Canadian humanitarian organization that is working towards ensuring no poverty and no equality among the community in all. So they approached the serving corps members at the camp, telling them to come and volunteer with the organization in providing services in certain communities that they will be posted to. At first, I wasn't interested because I am a farmer. Then I realized that there are several areas where I can render my service to. I can also render my service to youths, encouraging them to have a sustainable means of livelihood in agriculture. There and then, I key in, I applied, I became a volunteer. So after volunteering with CUSO International, I then had the interest of working as a humanitarian person. I worked with CUSO International for a year, and thereafter I moved for my second degree studies, Masters in Agricultural Economics at Ahmadu Bello University Zaria. So because of the distance of the place I was rendering the humanitarian service and the place I'm studying, I had to then resign from that particular role. Thereafter, while I was working, I was studying with at Ahmadu Bello University Zaria. Then I also had the opportunity to also volunteer with Action Against Hunger in Borno State. Because of the insurgency, the people in the IDP camp needed humanitarian service. Then I said to myself, I would volunteer to provide that service. After working with Action Against Hunger, thereafter I worked as a farm manager with Agro News Nigeria, and then here I am today working with FX Commodities Exchange, impacting life and providing humanitarian services to the humanity. While volunteering with CUSO International and Action Against Hunger, Feed the Future and all that on other short projects, I then developed that inherent, will I say, likeness of providing humanitarian services to the entire humanity. Then one day I was sitting on my laptop checking through online. Then I decided, I said, no, I need to look at some kind of humanitarian courses that I would attend so I can enhance my skills and my ability to deliver more in the humanitarian sector. So I went online and then I was searching there, and then I came across Humanitarian Global, and then immediately I signed up. I checked the programs that they have. I looked at one particular program that attracted my attention, which is monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, MEAL in short. So I then applied for MEAL program.